The lantern swings slowly in the dark. Its flame flickers against the rotting wood of a farmhouse that hasn't known warmth in decades. The wind moves through the mountains with a sound like breathing, like something ancient stirring beneath the soil. In the hills of West Virginia, where the fog clings to the hollows like shrouds over the dead, there are stories that never leave. Stories that burrow into the ground and wait. Stories about a boy who should not have existed. In the winter of 1910, a child was born in these mountains who could speak languages he had never heard, who could solve equations no teacher had shown him, who knew things about the world that no living person had told him. The doctors came. The scientists came. The reporters came. And when they left, they took their notebooks and their theories, but they could not take the fear, because what they found in that house was not a miracle. It was something else entirely. Something that still whispers through these mountains when the moon is dark, and the wind carries voices that belong to no one living. Welcome to this channel. Today, we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Caldwell family lived 7 miles outside the town of Bramwell, West Virginia, in a valley so narrow the sun touched it for only 4 hours each day. The house was built in 1872 by Samuel Caldwell, a coal worker who died in a tunnel collapse before his 30th birthday. His widow, Margaret, raised 3 children alone in that house, and when she died in 1898, her daughter Eliza inherited the property. Eliza married a man named Thomas Garrett in 1902. Thomas was quiet, withdrawn, a man who preferred the company of his pigs and chickens to other human beings. The marriage was not a happy one. Neighbors reported hearing arguments that echoed through the valley at night. Eliza's sister, who lived 2 miles down the road, told the local minister that Thomas had a temper, that he would disappear into the woods for days at a time and return with mud on his boots and a look in his eyes like he had seen something he could not name. In 1909, Eliza became pregnant. The pregnancy was difficult. She spent the final 3 months bedridden, attended by a midwife named Ruth Holloway, who later testified that Eliza spoke in her sleep, speaking words that were not English, not any language Ruth had ever heard. On the night of January 14, 1910, during a snowstorm that buried the valley under 2 feet of white silence, Eliza gave birth to a boy. They named him Daniel. The birth was unremarkable. The child was healthy. He cried like any newborn. But Ruth Holloway would later write in her journal, a journal that was discovered in her attic in 1967, that when she first looked into the baby's eyes, she felt a coldness move through her body like winter water. And she knew, though she could not say why, that something was wrong. Daniel Garrett was a quiet infant. He rarely cried. He watched everything with dark, unblinking eyes. By the time he was 6 months old, Eliza told her sister that Daniel would not sleep unless the room was completely dark, that any light, even moonlight through the curtains, would cause him to scream with a fury that seemed impossible for such a small body. Thomas, who had barely spoken to his son since the birth, began spending even more time away from the house. In October of 1910, Eliza's sister visited and found Eliza sitting in the kitchen, staring at the wall. When she asked what was wrong, Eliza whispered that Daniel had said his first word. Her sister smiled and asked what the word was. Eliza turned to her with tears running down her face and said, "It was not a word from any language I know. It was not a word a baby should be able to speak. It sounded old. It sounded like it came from somewhere else." When Daniel was 14 months old, a traveling minister named Reverend Paul Wickham came through Bramwell holding revival meetings. He visited the Garrett house as part of his rounds, and Eliza, desperate for guidance, asked him to bless the child. Reverend Wickham agreed. He held Daniel in his arms and began to pray. According to his own written account, which was published in a religious newsletter in 1911, the child looked up at him and spoke a complete sentence in what Wickham believed was Latin. Wickham had studied Latin in seminary. He understood enough to know that the sentence was grammatically correct and that it translated roughly as, "You do not know what stands before you." Wickham put the child down and left the house immediately. He later wrote that he could not explain what he had heard, that he had served God for 30 years and witnessed many strange things, but never had he felt such a presence of wrongness as he felt in that moment. By the time Daniel was 2 years old, the stories had begun to spread through the valley. Eliza had stopped attending church. Thomas had taken to drinking. The neighbors avoided the Garrett property. In the spring of 1912, a schoolteacher named Helen Marsh was visiting a family friend near the Garrett house when she encountered Daniel playing alone in the yard. She approached him, curious, and asked him his name. Daniel looked up at her and began reciting mathematical sequences, not simple counting. Complex equations, sequences that involved geometric progressions and algebraic formulas. Helen, who had studied mathematics at a women's college in Charleston, recognized what she was hearing. She asked Daniel where he had learned these things. Daniel said, "I have always known them." Helen returned to town and spoke to the local doctor, a man named Dr. Victor Brennan, about what she had witnessed. Dr. Brennan was skeptical. He agreed to visit the Garrett house himself. Dr. Brennan's report, which was submitted to the West Virginia Medical Society in December of 1912, documented his 3 visits to the Garrett home. On his first visit, Daniel, then 2 years and 8 months old, demonstrated an ability to read aloud from a book of Greek philosophy that had belonged to Samuel Caldwell and had been sitting on a shelf untouched for decades. The book was in ancient Greek. Daniel read it fluently. On his second visit, Brennan brought a colleague, Dr. James Sutherland, a specialist in childhood development. Together, they tested Daniel's language abilities. They spoke to him in English, and he responded. They spoke to him in French, and he responded in French. They spoke to him in German, and he responded in German. Neither Eliza nor Thomas spoke anything but English. There were no books in foreign languages in the house except for the Greek text. The doctors asked Daniel how he knew these languages. Daniel said, "I remember them." When they asked what he meant, he said, "I remember them from before." If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Dr. Brennan's third visit occurred in late November of 1912. He brought with him a professor of linguistics from West Virginia University, a Dr. Arnold Keating. Keating spent 4 hours with Daniel, during which time the child spoke in 7 different languages, including one that Keating identified as a dialect of Aramaic that had not been spoken in over 1,500 years. Keating documented that Daniel could not only speak these languages but could write in them, producing characters and symbols with a precision that suggested formal training. When Keating asked Daniel to explain how he had acquired this knowledge, Daniel said, "It has always been inside me. I did not learn it. I woke up knowing it." Keating pressed further. He asked Daniel if he remembered anything before being born. Daniel looked at him for a long time and then he said, "I remember the cold. I remember the waiting. I remember the ones who came before." In January of 1913, the story reached the newspapers. The Charleston Gazette published an article titled, "The Genius Child of Bramwell, a Medical Marvel or Something More." The article described Daniel's abilities and included statements from Dr. Brennan and Professor Keating. The response was immediate. Reporters descended on the valley. Photographers arrived. Scientists from universities across the East Coast wrote letters requesting permission to study the child. Thomas Garrett refused all requests. He had become increasingly paranoid and hostile. According to neighbors, he had boarded up several windows in the house and had been seen walking the property line at night carrying a rifle. Eliza, meanwhile, had grown pale and thin. A woman who delivered eggs to the house told the local grocer that Eliza looked like she had not slept in months, that her hands shook constantly, and that she flinched whenever Daniel entered the room. On the night of March 7, 1913, something happened in the Garrett house. The details remain unclear. What is known is this. At approximately 2 in the morning, a neighbor named Jacob Turner, whose property bordered the Garrett land, heard screaming. It was not the scream of a child. It was the scream of a woman in absolute terror. Turner grabbed his lantern and ran toward the Garrett house. By the time he arrived, the screaming had stopped. The front door was open. Inside, he found Eliza sitting on the floor of the kitchen, rocking back and forth, her nightgown torn, her face streaked with tears. Thomas was upstairs in the bedroom, unconscious, a bottle of whiskey overturned beside him. Daniel was standing in the corner of the kitchen, perfectly still, staring at the wall. When Turner asked Eliza what had happened, she could not speak. She only pointed at Daniel and shook her head over and over. Eliza was taken to her sister's house that night. She remained there for 3 weeks. During that time, she spoke only once about what had occurred. She told her sister that Daniel had come into her room in the middle of the night and had stood at the foot of her bed. She said he had not moved, had not spoken, but that she had heard a voice in her head, a voice that was not his, a voice that was many voices speaking at once, and they had told her that Daniel was not her son, that he had never been her son, that something else had come into the world wearing his shape. When her sister asked what she meant, Eliza began to weep and said, "He is a door. He is a door to something I cannot close." Thomas Garrett left the house in April of 1913 and never returned. He was found 6 weeks later in a boarding house in Huntington, West Virginia, dead from alcohol poisoning. Daniel remained in the house, cared for sporadically by neighbors who were too frightened to refuse but too disturbed to stay long. In May of 1913, Eliza returned. She had no choice. The house was hers, and she had nowhere else to go. But the woman who came back was not the same woman who had left. She moved through the house like a ghost. She cooked meals in silence. She avoided looking at Daniel. At night, she locked herself in her bedroom and pushed furniture against the door. In the summer of 1913, Professor Keating returned to Bramwell with 2 colleagues from Johns Hopkins University. They had received funding to conduct a comprehensive study of Daniel's abilities. Eliza granted them permission on the condition that they take Daniel away from the house during the day. For 6 weeks, the scientists worked with Daniel in a rented room above the general store in Bramwell. They documented everything. Daniel could perform calculus without instruction. He could identify constellations and name stars in languages that predated modern astronomy. He could describe historical events with an accuracy that suggested he had witnessed them. One researcher, Dr. Milton Cross, wrote in his notes that Daniel spoke about the fall of Constantinople in 1453 as though recalling a personal memory, describing details about the siege that were later verified against historical records but were not commonly known. But it was not just knowledge that disturbed the researchers. It was the way Daniel acquired it. Dr. Cross documented an experiment in which he presented Daniel with a sealed envelope containing a handwritten letter in Polish, a language Daniel had never been exposed to. Without opening the envelope, Daniel recited the contents of the letter word for word. When asked how he knew what was inside, Daniel said, "I can hear it. I can hear all of it. The words, the thoughts behind the words. The person who wrote it. They are still there, inside the paper." Cross repeated the experiment multiple times with different materials. Each time, Daniel demonstrated the same ability. He seemed to perceive information not through conventional sensory channels, but through some other means that the researchers could not categorize. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In August of 1913, Dr. Cross conducted what he called the memory test. He asked Daniel to describe his earliest memory. Daniel sat silently for several minutes and then he began to speak. He described a place that was dark and cold, a place without walls or ceiling, a place where he was not alone. He said there were others there, many others, waiting. When Cross asked what they were waiting for, Daniel said to come through, to find a door. Cross asked if Daniel was the door. Daniel looked at him and said, "I am one of many doors. There have always been doors. There will always be doors." Cross asked where these doors led. Daniel said, "To here, to your world, from the place beneath." The researchers left Bramwell in September of 1913. Their findings were never formally published. Dr. Cross submitted a draft of a paper to the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1914, but it was rejected. The rejection letter stated that the claims were too extraordinary and lacked sufficient empirical foundation. Cross attempted to publish through other channels, but the scientific community was not interested. The case of Daniel Garrett was quietly forgotten. The researchers moved on to other work. The newspapers stopped writing about him, and in the valley outside Bramwell, the boy continued to grow. By 1915, Daniel was 5 years old. He no longer attended church. He no longer played with other children. The neighbors had stopped visiting entirely. Eliza had aged 20 years and 5. She spoke to no one. She left the house only to buy supplies, and when she did, she moved quickly, her eyes fixed on the ground. The grocer in Bramwell later recalled that Eliza would place her money on the counter without a word and leave before he could give her change. In October of 1915, Eliza's sister received a letter. It was written in Eliza's hand, but the handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. The letter said, "I cannot do this anymore. I know what he is. I know what is inside him. I have tried to be his mother, but I cannot mother something that is not a child. I hear them at night. I hear them whispering through him. They want to come through. They are waiting for him to grow strong enough. Please pray for me. Please pray that God has mercy on what I must do." 2 days later, Eliza Garrett was found dead in her bedroom. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure. She was 34 years old. But the local doctor who examined her body, a young physician named Dr. Harold Penn, later told his wife that there was no medical explanation for Eliza's death. Her heart had simply stopped. There was no disease, no injury, no apparent cause. Dr. Penn said that when he looked at Eliza's face, he saw an expression he had never seen before. It was not pain. It was not sadness. It was terror so profound that it seemed to have frozen her features into a mask of absolute horror. Daniel Garrett, now an orphan, was placed in the care of Eliza's sister, Margaret Holloway. Margaret lived with her husband, a farmer named John, and their 2 children in a small house 2 miles from the Garrett property. Margaret was a devout woman, practical and strong-willed. She believed that Daniel simply needed structure, discipline, and love. She believed that the stories about him were exaggerations born of ignorance and superstition. She believed she could save him. She was wrong. Within a month of Daniel's arrival, strange things began to happen in the Holloway house. Objects would move on their own. Doors would open and close without anyone touching them. The children reported hearing footsteps in the attic at night, though no one was there. John Holloway, a skeptical man who had little patience for talk of the supernatural, began to experience vivid nightmares. He dreamed of a vast darkness, a void without end, and figures moving within it, reaching toward him. He would wake in the middle of the night drenched in sweat, convinced that something was standing at the foot of his bed. Margaret tried to maintain normalcy, but it became increasingly difficult. Daniel did not play with his cousins. He did not speak unless spoken to. He spent hours sitting in the corner of the parlor, staring at nothing, his lips moving silently as though he were having a conversation with someone no one else could see. In December of 1915, Margaret found a series of drawings that Daniel had made. They were hidden under his bed, dozens of them. Drawn in charcoal on scraps of paper, the drawings depicted figures that were not quite human. They had too many limbs, too many eyes, shapes that twisted in ways that hurt to look at. In the center of each drawing was a doorway, and through the doorway more figures were emerging. Margaret burned the drawings in the fireplace. That night, Daniel came into her bedroom while she was sleeping. He stood beside her bed and said, "You should not have done that. They do not like to be forgotten." Margaret woke and found him there, his face expressionless, his eyes reflecting the moonlight like glass. She asked him what he meant. Daniel said, "They are coming. They have always been coming. I am only the first." If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In January of 1916, John Holloway made the decision to send Daniel to an institution. There was a facility in Weston, West Virginia, the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, that took children with severe behavioral disturbances. John wrote to the administrators explaining the situation. He did not mention the supernatural elements. He simply stated that Daniel was unmanageable, that he posed a danger to the other children, and that he required professional care. The administrators agreed to accept him. On the morning of January 28, 1916, John and Margaret drove Daniel to Weston. The drive took 6 hours. Daniel did not speak the entire time. When they arrived at the asylum, a massive Gothic structure of stone and iron, Daniel looked up at the building and smiled. It was the first time Margaret had ever seen him smile. She later told her minister that the smile made her feel as though she were looking into the face of something ancient and pleased with itself. Daniel Garrett spent the next 3 years in the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum. The records from his time there are incomplete. Many files were lost in a fire in 1934. What remains suggests that Daniel was kept in the children's ward on the 4th floor, that he was observed by doctors and nurses, and that he was generally described as cooperative, quiet, and unnervingly intelligent. One nurse, in a letter to her sister dated March 1917, wrote that Daniel would sometimes stand at the window of his room for hours, looking out at the hills, and that once when she asked him what he was looking at, he said, "I am watching them come closer." When she asked who, he said, "The ones like me, the ones who have found their doors." In April of 1918, a doctor named Lawrence Pritchard was assigned to Daniel's case. Pritchard was a young psychiatrist trained in the new methods of psychoanalysis. He believed that Daniel's behavior could be explained through trauma, through repressed memories, through the dysfunctional environment in which he had been raised. Pritchard conducted weekly sessions with Daniel. He took extensive notes. In one session, Pritchard asked Daniel about his mother. Daniel said, "She was afraid because she understood. She felt us inside me. She knew I was not alone." Pritchard asked what Daniel meant by us. Daniel said, "We are many. We have always been many. We were here before your kind learned to speak. We were here in the dark places, in the spaces between. We wait. We listen. And when a door opens, when a child is born who can hold us, we come through." Pritchard's notes from that session include the observation that Daniel spoke in a manner inconsistent with his age and education. Pritchard wrote that Daniel's voice seemed to shift in tone and inflection, as though multiple people were speaking through him. Pritchard attempted to dismiss this as a psychological defense mechanism, a form of dissociation. But in later sessions, Pritchard found it increasingly difficult to maintain his clinical detachment. In June of 1918, Pritchard wrote in his journal that he had begun to have nightmares similar to those described by John Holloway. He dreamed of vast underground spaces, of voices calling to him, of doorways opening onto darkness. He wrote that he could not shake the feeling that something was watching him, that it was aware of him through his contact with Daniel. In August of 1918, Pritchard abruptly resigned from the asylum. He left no forwarding address. A colleague later reported that Pritchard had suffered a nervous breakdown, that he had become convinced he was being followed, that he had become obsessed with the idea that there were things in the world that should not be studied, should not be known. Pritchard was found dead in a hotel room in Pittsburgh in 1921. The cause of death was listed as suicide. He had hanged himself. In his room, police found a notebook filled with drawings nearly identical to the ones Margaret Holloway had burned in 1915. Daniel Garrett was released from the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum in October of 1919. He was 9 years old. The administrators determined that he was no longer a danger to himself or others, that he had demonstrated remarkable intellectual development, and that continued institutionalization was not warranted. There was no family to return him to. Margaret Holloway had made it clear that he was not welcome in her home. So Daniel was placed with a foster family in the town of Grafton, West Virginia, a childless couple named Edward and Ruth Simmons who operated a boarding house. The Simmons were good people, kind and patient. They believed that every child deserved a chance. They enrolled Daniel in school. He excelled. By the time he was 10, he was reading at a college level. By the time he was 11, he had taught himself advanced mathematics and was corresponding with professors at universities across the country. The Simmons were proud of him, but they also noticed things. Daniel never seemed to sleep. Ruth would check on him late at night and find him sitting up in bed, staring at the wall, his eyes open and unblinking. Edward mentioned that Daniel would sometimes speak in his sleep, speaking in languages Edward did not recognize, speaking in voices that did not sound like a child's voice. In the spring of 1923, when Daniel was 13 years old, a series of strange events occurred in Grafton. Animals began to disappear. Dogs, cats, chickens. At first, people assumed it was a predator, a fox or a coyote. But then livestock began to vanish. A farmer lost 3 cows in one night. Another lost an entire pen of pigs. The animals were not killed. They simply vanished. No blood, no tracks, no signs of struggle. People began to talk. They began to remember the stories from Bramwell. They began to look at Daniel Garrett with suspicion. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? In June of 1923, a young girl named Sarah Thornton went missing. She was 7 years old. She had been playing in her yard and had simply vanished. A search party combed the woods for days. They found no trace of her. 2 weeks later, Sarah reappeared. She was found standing on the steps of the church in the center of town at dawn. She was unharmed physically, but she could not speak. She would not speak. Her parents took her to doctors, to specialists, but Sarah remained silent. The only thing she would do was draw. She drew pictures of a boy standing in a doorway. She drew pictures of darkness pouring out of his mouth. She drew pictures of hands reaching up from beneath the ground. When asked to identify the boy in her drawings, Sarah pointed to a photograph of Daniel Garrett that had appeared in the local newspaper following an academic award he had received. The town erupted. A mob formed. They marched to the Simmons boarding house demanding that Daniel be turned over. Edward Simmons refused. He stood on his porch with a shotgun and told the crowd that Daniel had done nothing wrong, that there was no evidence, that they were acting out of fear and ignorance. The sheriff arrived and dispersed the crowd, but the damage was done. Daniel could no longer stay in Grafton. Ruth Simmons made arrangements for Daniel to be sent to a private school in Virginia, a place for gifted children where his intellect could be nurtured and where he would be safe from the prejudices of small-town ignorance. In August of 1923, Daniel left Grafton. He was 13 years old. He never spoke to the Simmons again. Years later, Ruth would tell a reporter that on the day Daniel left, he turned to her and said, "Thank you for your kindness. I am sorry for what is coming." She asked him what he meant. He said, "The doors are opening. There are more of us now, you will see." Daniel Garrett attended the Ashford Academy in Richmond, Virginia from 1923 to 1927. The records show that he was an exceptional student. He graduated at the age of 17 with honors in mathematics, philosophy, and classical languages. He was accepted to Princeton University on a full scholarship, but he never attended. In September of 1927, 1 week before he was scheduled to leave for New Jersey, Daniel disappeared. He left no note. He took no belongings. He simply vanished. The search for Daniel Garrett lasted 6 months. Newspapers across the East Coast published his photograph. Investigators interviewed everyone who had known him, but no trace of him was found. In March of 1928, the case was closed. Daniel Garrett was declared a missing person, and then, for over a decade, there was silence. In 1939, a man fitting Daniel's description was seen in a small town in Kentucky. A local minister reported that a stranger had come to his church and had sat in the back pew during the evening service. After the service, the stranger approached the minister and asked if he believed in doorways between worlds. The minister, unsettled, said he did not understand the question. The stranger smiled and said, "You will. They are opening everywhere now." The man left before the minister could ask his name. But several parishioners who had known Daniel Garrett from newspaper photographs 20 years earlier swore that the stranger was him. He had not aged a day. Similar sightings occurred over the following years. In 1941, A teacher in Ohio reported a man who appeared at her schoolhouse claiming to be a visiting lecturer. He spoke to her students for an hour about ancient history, about civilizations that existed before recorded time, about the cycles of rising and falling, about the things that wait in the dark places beneath the earth. When the teacher asked for his credentials, the man smiled and said, "I have no credentials. I only have knowledge." And knowledge is a door that, once opened, can never be closed. The teacher later identified the man from a photograph as Daniel Garrett. In 1946, a librarian in Pennsylvania found a series of journals hidden in the stacks. The journals were handwritten, undated, and unsigned. They contained detailed descriptions of rituals, of symbols, of methods for opening doorways to other planes of existence. The handwriting matched samples of Daniel Garrett's writing from his school days. The journals were turned over to local authorities and were subsequently lost, but the librarian made copies of several pages before surrendering them. Those copies still exist. They describe a process by which certain individuals who are born with what the author calls an open architecture of consciousness, can serve as conduits for entities that exist outside normal space and time. The journals claim that these individuals have always existed, that they appear throughout history, and that they are increasing in number. In 1952, a psychiatrist named Dr. Ellen Marks published a paper in the Journal of Parapsychology titled "The Genius Child Phenomenon, a Case Study in Anomalous Cognition." The paper examined 12 documented cases of children who exhibited abilities similar to those of Daniel Garrett. Dr. Marks concluded that these children demonstrated patterns of knowledge acquisition that could not be explained by conventional learning theory. She proposed that they were accessing information through a mechanism that was not yet understood by science. The paper was controversial. It was criticized by mainstream psychologists as pseudoscience, but it attracted the attention of researchers in parapsychology and fringe scientific communities. Dr. Marks received dozens of letters from parents claiming that their children exhibited similar abilities. She began to compile a database. By 1957, she had documented over 80 cases. Dr. Marks attempted to locate Daniel Garrett. She believed that he was the key to understanding the phenomenon. She spent years searching. She tracked down everyone who had known him. She visited Bramwell, Grafton, Richmond. She interviewed elderly townspeople who remembered him. One woman, the daughter of the grocer who had known Eliza Garrett, told Dr. Marks that her father had always believed Daniel was cursed, that he was possessed by something that had come from the old places in the mountains, places that the Native Americans had avoided, places where the ground felt wrong and the air tasted like metal. The woman said her father had told her that there were always stories in Appalachia about children who were born different, children who knew things they should not know, children who spoke to things that were not there. The old people called them the opened ones. They said the opened ones were doorways for the things that lived beneath the earth, the things that had been here long before humans, the things that were patient and hungry and waiting. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Dr. Marks never found Daniel Garrett. She died in 1968. Her research was archived at the University of Virginia. In 2003, a graduate student writing a thesis on early parapsychology research accessed Dr. Marks's files. The student found something that Dr. Marks had never published. It was a letter dated 1964 from a man claiming to be Daniel Garrett. The letter was typed on plain paper with no return address. It read, "Dr. Marks, I have read your work with great interest. You are correct in your hypothesis, though you do not yet understand the scope of what you have discovered. We are not anomalies. We are not mutations. We are the result of a process that has been unfolding for millennia. The entities you refer to in your notes as external intelligences are not external. They are foundational. They were here first. They built the architecture of this reality. And they have been waiting for the right conditions to return. Those conditions are approaching. The doors are opening more frequently now. There are hundreds of us. Soon there will be thousands. Your species has always sensed this. You have myths about it, stories of beings that wear human skin, stories of children who are not children, stories of voices from below. These are not fantasies. They are memories. Fragmented and distorted, but memories nonetheless. You cannot stop what is coming. But you can understand it, and perhaps in understanding you can prepare. The letter was unsigned. The graduate student included the letter in her thesis. The thesis was published online. It attracted little attention, but in 2008, a blogger specializing in paranormal phenomena came across the thesis and wrote a post about Daniel Garrett. The post went viral. Suddenly, people began coming forward with their own stories. A man in Tennessee claimed that his grandfather had told him about a boy in West Virginia who could speak to the dead. A woman in North Carolina said that her great-aunt had been a teacher who had encountered a child in the 1920s, who had predicted the stock market crash of 1929 and World War II with perfect accuracy. A retired journalist from Ohio wrote that he had investigated a case in the 1950s involving a teenager who had been arrested for trespassing in a cemetery at night. The teenager had been found standing over a grave, speaking in a language the police could not identify. When questioned, the teenager had said he was listening to the ones below, the ones who were waiting to come through. The journalist had never published the story because he could not verify it, but he remembered the teenager's name. It was listed in the police report as Daniel Garrett. In 2010, a documentary filmmaker named Marcus Holt attempted to make a film about Daniel Garrett. Holt traveled to West Virginia, to Bramwell, to Grafton, to Weston. He interviewed descendants of the people who had known Daniel. He obtained copies of old newspaper articles, medical records, and court documents. He visited the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which had been abandoned since 1994 and was now a tourist attraction offering ghost tour. Holt spent a night in the asylum filming. He set up cameras on the 4th floor in the children's ward in the room where Daniel had been kept. At 3 in the morning, every camera malfunctioned simultaneously. When Holt reviewed the footage later, he found that in the minutes before the malfunction, the cameras had captured strange visual distortions, shadows that moved against the light, shapes that seemed to form and dissolve. And on the audio track beneath the ambient noise, there was a voice. It was speaking in a language Holt did not recognize. He sent the audio to a linguist at Georgetown University. The linguist identified the language as a dialect of Sumerian, one of the oldest recorded languages on Earth. The words, when translated, were, "We are here. We have always been here. We are waiting for the doors to open." Holt abandoned the project. He destroyed the footage. He never spoke publicly about what he had experienced. But in a private interview given to a colleague in 2012, Holt said that he believed Daniel Garrett was real, that he was still alive, and that he was not alone. Holt said, "There are more of them. I do not know how many, but they are out there, and they are connected to something old, something that predates human civilization. Something that is patient and intelligent and utterly alien." Holt died in 2015 from a sudden heart attack. He was 42 years old. Today, the Caldwell house, the original Garrett property outside Bramwell, still stands. It is abandoned. The windows are broken. The roof has collapsed in places. Local teenagers dare each other to go inside. Most refuse. Those who do report feeling overwhelming dread, hearing whispers, seeing movement in the corners of their vision. In 2018, a team of paranormal investigators visited the property with recording equipment. They spent 6 hours inside the house. The recordings captured hours of ambient noise and then, at the 4-hour mark, a voice. It was a child's voice. It said, "More are coming. The doors are opening. You will see us soon." No one knows what happened to Daniel Garrett. Some believe he is dead, that he died decades ago, that the sightings are hoaxes or mistaken identity. Others believe he is alive, that he is somewhere out there, unchanged, waiting. And others believe something else entirely. They believe that Daniel Garrett was never truly human, that he was always a doorway, and that the thing that came through him is still moving through the world, opening other doors, creating more like him. In the hills of West Virginia, in the hollows where the fog never lifts, people still tell stories. Stories about children who are born knowing things they should not know. Stories about voices in the dark. Stories about doorways that open onto places that should not exist. And on certain nights when the wind moves through the mountains like breathing, you can almost hear them. The whispers, the voices from below, the ones who have always been waiting. The case of Daniel Garrett is not solved. It may never be solved, but the question remains. The question that haunted everyone who ever encountered him. The question that still haunts those who study his story. If Daniel was a door, then what came through? And how many more doors are opening? The lantern swings slowly in the dark.